We're going to be talking about Ruth today. Ruth, it's Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. Just, she's the third person that Matthew mentions in the lineage of Jesus, the third woman that he mentions in the lineage of Jesus. The first was Tamar, and then we had Rahab, and we talked about them, and then the third is Ruth. He bore Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. So Boaz and Ruth had Obed, who then would give us others, and we'd see them in Matthew 1. So here's what I'm going to do. I did mention earlier, I sent an email out. If you don't get my emails, let me know. You can text Connect to that number and just tell us, I didn't get an email, and we'll make sure you're on that list. But I did send an email and said, hey, if you get a chance, read the book of Ruth. You might want to read it. I'm not going to stand here and read 4 chapters. They're not long, but I'm not going to read all of it. But I'm going to highlight, I'm going to kind of make sure we all know the story, and I'll highlight a few things in it as we go. And then we'll look at a couple of things that stood out to me in it. It's a great book, and I think in the past, maybe I can't remember if we've preached through the book of Ruth. I think I might have several years ago, but it certainly bears spending plenty of time in. But since we've got one sermon to address Ruth, I'm just going to highlight a few things, and you'll just have to forgive me for not saying everything that can be said about Ruth. So let's start out. In the very beginning, it tells us that Ruth, that's not what it tells us in the beginning. The beginning starts with a couple named Naomi and Elimelech. Who are they? Well, they were Israelite people. They were living in the land and farming. And a famine hits, and they have some struggle. And things dry up, and they're not producing enough food. And they did what probably a lot of our ancestors did, if we're North Dakotans. They went west. They went west, young man, actually, they went a little east. But they went to what they thought might be better prospects. They went to a place called Moab. They took their 2 boys, Chilion and Mahlon. I know, they didn't like their kids very much. But they took their 2 boys, and they went to Moab to farm and to grow and to try to hopefully produce better for themselves and make a better life. In the course of time, Chilion and Mahlon get married to these 2 young Moabite women named Orpah, and Ruth. I always thought Orpah may be where Oprah's parents got her name. They just switched the R and I don't know. Anyway. But so Orpah and Ruth marry into the family. And then Elimelech, Dad, Chilion, and Mahlon all die. All the men died. So now we're left with these 3 widows. Now we've already talked about what life is like for particularly a widow, single woman in general, particularly a widow in this era. They could not own property. They were often considered more like property than actual property owners. And that's just the reality that they lived in. And so Naomi says to her daughters-in-law, I can't provide for you. I cannot take care of you. I don't have the resources. I don't have the status. I don't have the power. I have nothing to offer you. Go home. She's like, I'm just going to limp back to my people, back in Israel. Go home. Go to your parents' house. Maybe they can take care of you because I can't do it. Orpah is like, okay, sounds good. Thank you. And she goes home. And Ruth says this very famous line to her. She says, nope. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. And your God will be my God. Everything I know, everything I've grown up around, everything I've been, my family, gone. Everything. From now on, your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. I'm going to die where you die. That's what Ruth says to her. And so they go. And they go back home. This is fascinating because I just love this little bit. And this isn't really about Ruth, but it's an important part of the story that I would really spend more time on if we had it. But when Naomi and Ruth get there, and people are like, oh, Naomi, hey, welcome back. It's good to see you. And by the way, Naomi means pleasant. That's what the name means. And she says to her friends who are welcoming her back, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, which means bitter. Don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. And I just think there's something for us here to hear. Again, there's a lot to say about this, and I'm not going to dwell on everything, but I want us, there are many of us here who feel like we cannot go into the church and tell the church people, I feel like the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. I feel empty. And I want you to see that the Bible gives us space and permission. And actually, I'd even say encouragement to say that if that's what we're feeling. She says, I'm not pleasant, I'm bitter. Some of us feel like we have to pretend to be pleasant when we show up here. Naomi didn't, and I don't think God does either. And I think that's just permission. That's permission and an encouragement for you and I to be honest with each other and to be honest with God, because Naomi models that very well, I think. That's just her reality. That's all I'll say about that. I think it's important here. Okay, so they come back home, and there's still two widows with nothing and no prospects and no land and no anything. And so Naomi encourages, Ruth asks, and Naomi says, yes, do that. Her to do what a lot of people did, what a lot of poor people did in that time, and that is to follow along behind people who were reaping their field. It's actually a law in Israel. It's written in other places in the Old Testament. God commanded the people who were farmers to go one time through the rows of corn or barley in this case, or wheat or whatever they were growing, to go one time and to leave everything else that you didn't get on the first pass, so that the people in poverty situations could just follow through and pick up what was left over. This is God's way of providing for the poor. God has no problem. This is interesting for those of us who live in such a weird culture. God has no problem with people making a profit off of their land. He also commands generosity. And I think that's really important for us to hear. And so that was her job. You know, we live in an era, this is a true story. When I was in college, I worked at a pizza place. We had one of those buffets, the pizza buffet. I don't encourage pizza buffets. I generally don't encourage buffets. But anyway, we had this buffet. And, you always want you can't have a pizza plate out on the buffet with like one slice of pizza on it. That looks bad, right? We threw away every lunch and a couple of dinners a week, we had a buffet out. We'd throw away 40 pizzas easy when we were making it. And we were forbidden from eating it or giving it away. Because, God forbid, they might be willing to pay for it instead of getting it free. We did that. Now, I was in college, so I was certainly in, poverty situation. But I actually know people who've made their whole grocery bill, a monthly grocery bill, off of going in the back of grocery stores and getting, good food, unopened jugs of milk, nothing, veggies, nothing wrong with, because we throw away so much food. And God says that is sick. I just think maybe we need to hear that. Anyway, this is Ruth's job. She's following along behind the reaper. She's picking up all the leftovers. She actually goes home with 22 liters one day, which is a lot, right, of barley that she's been picking up. And along the way, she meets the guy whose field she's working in, Boaz, and he says to her, and I think is really good. Now listen, my daughter, don't go in another field. Just stay right here. Stay close to the other women that are working here. Listen, I just love, have I not charged the young men not to touch you? We're going to talk about that, and I think it's very important that we see that Boaz is telling all the other men that may be working in the field, don't you touch her. I think we'll see why that's important. Because it's a difficult culture for a vulnerable woman. And that's what's happening here. Ruth is at the height of vulnerability, truly. She's a foreigner. She's a widow. She has no man to care for her in that broken system that was there, and she's just vulnerable. And Boaz tells the people, don't abuse, don't exploit, don't manipulate, do not. And he offers her, he tells her, stay close. and you'll be saved. I think that's interesting. We'll talk more about that. Verse 22, I wrote down. Naomi said to her daughter, wait. Oh, yeah, okay. I wanted to point this out. This is actually verse 20. We find out that Boaz is a redeemer. We talked about this situation. We talked about Tamar, how the law protected widows by somebody in the family being eligible and able to marry so that she can have children, sons, let's be honest, in their culture, sons who will grow up and provide for her. That was the system. And so we find out that Boaz is a potential for that. And then chapter 3, this cracks me up because the first thing I thought of when I read chapter 3 was the Reba McEntire song, Fancy. Some of you know that song, where, Fancy's mama, it's certainly not exact, but Fancy's mom gets her all washed up, cleaned up, and dressed up to go out and be nice to the gentleman, Fancy, and they'll be nice to you. Yeah, okay. It kind of reminds me of that because Naomi kind of gets her, she washes her up and anoints her and does all this stuff, and she says, go kind of make yourself available to Boaz, is essentially what Naomi says. And so this all happens at the harvest time. And what's happening, and I think it's important, I spent a lot more time reading articles and commentaries than I should have this week about what really goes on here. We got to understand the ancient cultures in order to really be able to understand what's happening. And there's a lot of, I think, misinterpretations of this scene that happens next. But what is happening is it's kind of like Oktoberfest, right? It's a big party, a big celebration at the end of the harvest. We brought it all in, woohoo, let's have a good time. And things could get rowdy at these events. Things could get a little out of hand. As a matter of fact, we see what happens. It tells us right here, verse 7, when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he goes and lays down. I mean, heart was merry is a bit of a euphemism for he did not need to drive home. Okay? He was having a good time, and he goes and he lays down, and Ruth uncovers his feet and lays down at his feet. Now, this is the bit that I really had to dig into because there's a lot of misinterpretations, and there's a bit of suggestion out there that feet is also a euphemism. She may have uncovered another thing, and I think that may not be an exact understanding of what I can't be positive. I wasn't there. I didn't have cameras, right? But I think feet are feet. Because what comes next, it seems to make sense to me that there's something else going on, is he wakes up and finds out that she's laying there, and she says to him, spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Or another way to put that is, put your garment, it could be translated, spread the corner of your garment over me, which is a symbol, it's used in other places in the Old Testament, for marriage. She is essentially proposing to Boaz. She's like, will you become my husband? Like that's really what's happening. Now, he says to her, may you be blessed by the Lord. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men. Here's the situation. That night, she would have had her pick of the young men because of the Oktoberfest situation happening and the big party that was going on, and there was a lot. It was not always an appropriate place, right? And that's what was going on. And she comes and lays down next to him and says, I need you to cover me. Okay, this last kindness is about her character. That's what it means. And he says, greater than the first. What is the first kindness? Caring for Naomi. Ruth could have stayed home. Ruth didn't have to come. Ruth didn't have to go through the fields and gather all the barley. Ruth has demonstrated to Boaz a commitment to care for someone who she's not legally bound. She's not responsible for Naomi. She chooses it. And that's the first kindness that I think Boaz has seen in her. He has seen in her a character that is willing to care before others. The second kindness is she's demonstrated her character as someone who wants to wait for a protector instead of whatever was going on that night at the Oktoberfest party. So she says, you're a redeemer. He says, yes, true, I am a redeemer. I could do that, but, Elimelech, right? I'm Elimelech's second cousin. I'm making this up. I don't know the exact relationships. I'm Elimelech's second cousin, but he's got a first cousin who actually has they call it like a first right of refusal, right? He gets that option first. And so, chapter 4, Boaz goes, sits down at the city gates, which is where you go to work out deals. He didn't go to courthouse. You don't go, to the police station. You go sit at the city gates, and he sees the first cousin. He's like, hey, there's that field. Elimelech had that field. You can buy that field if you want. And the guy's like, you're darn right, I'll buy the field. And this is really what happened. This is how they said it. You're darn right, I'll buy that field. And Elimelech says, or Boaz says to him, okay, good. Just, you got to marry Ruth and take care of Naomi, right? He's like, ooh, no thanks. So he said, I don't really want that responsibility. And Boaz said, awesome, I'll do it. And so Boaz ended up buying a field, marrying Ruth, and providing for Naomi. And then we have this, and I love this, after Ruth has a baby, the people in the town say this about Naomi: blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. I love that, because Ruth, this quote-unquote, right, valueless widow, this society has outcast, foreigner on top of everything else, and now the people say she is worth more to you than 7 sons, which is actually kind of astonishing when you think about in their world. It's an astonishing statement to make that Ruth is worth more than 7 sons. And I just think it's a powerful illustration of the way maybe our values and God's get a little bit inverted sometimes. From God's, I suppose. A few things I want to point out. First, we just want to look at how both Naomi and Ruth, but I'd say especially Ruth, demonstrate trust in God in just impossible circumstances. Just ridiculous how impossible this was. She is willing to abandon everything she's known. Her whole family, her hometown, her people. She is leaving all of that behind in order to join Naomi and go somewhere else. Now, we saw a little bit of this in Rahab last week, too. This willingness to just cast off everything over here in order to go there. That takes faith, deep faith. And I think we all probably know that. In fact, I wouldn't argue, I'll just tell you, that is what it means to grow. That is the definition of human growth, is to leave one place and go to another. That's how we become better people. That's why we become different people. Sandy mentioned the why, the fork in the road, right? We come, and I see it all the time. So many of us just want to dig our heels in and say, I'm not going anywhere. Or we want to take the one that looks most like that because I'm terrified. Because the future is terrifying. Other places are terrifying. Can you imagine what Ruth must have felt like? Just telling Naomi, from now on, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. I'm casting off everything behind me and I'm going somewhere different. That takes incredible faith because change is terrifying. But faith can defeat fear if we will let it. If we will allow God to use that. Interestingly, the Bible very often, it does not combat. Faith and doubt are not opposites. Faith and disobedience are. it equates faith with obedience. Because if you believe, if you trust God, you will follow, you will obey. Those things seem to be connected throughout. Ruth obeyed because she trusted. Now here's what I know. I know that every time we make a decision and we say, yeah, okay, I'll trust God and I will make that jump and I will go in that direction. Here's what I know. I know our faith grows just a little bit and we begin to trust just a little bit more that God actually means what He says. But we have to do it. Obedience. You don't get to have faith without a little bit of obedience. And a little bit of obedience creates a little more faith, and a little more faith creates a little more obedience. That is what it means to grow. That's what discipleship is. That's what growth is. That's what change looks like. Here's what I know. I know every single one of us has something going on right now, and you hear God saying to you, just trust me with that. Leave that thing behind and go pick that thing up. I believe every one of us, because I believe that's a daily thing. I think God is always saying that to His people. Leave that thing behind and go pick that thing up. All I'm saying to you is, yeah, do that. And if you do, you'll see that He is faithful. And then the next time He says do it, which will be tomorrow, it'll be a little easier to do. That's the first thing I see, is just this trusting God with incredible, impossible circumstances, and it pays off for her. It paid off. Another thing that stood out to me is, honestly, I know it's about Ruth. I know we're talking about Ruth, and we're going to get back to Ruth, but just Boaz. If I can just say, Boaz is an awesome dude. He's a protector. He's strong. He does what's right in that culture, and the way he says, "Don't let the young men touch you." Like, I'm not exaggerating when I say that it was not a good place for a single woman, let alone a widow. And he stepped in and he did something about that. And even when she was just a stranger to him, he protected her as a vulnerable woman in their culture. And I think there is something beautiful and truly masculine, if I can say that, about what he does. I was reading this meme the other day, and it said, the problem with men, or the problem with the world, I can't remember how to put it, is not toxic masculinity, but a lack of masculinity. And I had to think about that, right? Because, we're all, I don't know if you're aware of who Andrew Tate is, but if you're not, don't Google him. You won't find him because he's been banned from all the social media networks. We were talking about him at our dinner table. He is a misogynistic jerk who hates women, I think, and thinks I don't know what his deal is, but, toxic masculinity, he's the poster child. I think, okay, one quote or paraphrase, he prefers 19-year-olds because it's easier to leave your mark on them. That's what he said. It's awful, right? It hurts me to even say that out loud. Just a horrible, horrible person, but the poster child for toxic masculinity. And you know who loves Andrew Tate? Young men. Which is even more frightening, maybe, than the fact that he's out there. Just horrific. And I started asking why. And if you dig in a little bit, and there's research on this, you dig in a little bit, and the reason why is because these young men, true story, are saying, will someone please show us how to be men? And they are starving for role models who will talk about and model what it looks like to be a man. And they find people, maybe because the internet is a horrible place, true, or that's certain. You go out there and find it, you can find it. But also, they need men in their lives to tell them what it looks like to be a man. And so I really was thinking about this, and we've spent 2 generations in our culture telling little boys, no, sit still, be quiet, don't do that. We spent 2 generations rooting out masculinity. We spent 2 generations telling people, getting mad at men for holding doors for women or whatever. I don't know. We spent 2 generations saying masculinity's bad, and we get Andrew Tate. And I think that's why. I think maybe it's time to ask this question: what would the world be like if more men were like Boaz? And by like Boaz, I mean taking what you have, whatever power, whatever authority, whatever property, money, resources, and using that for the good of the vulnerable. And telling the other young men, don't do it. Commanding. He is commanding to an extent. He tells them what to do. And it's all for someone else. It's all to serve and care for others. That's what he uses all of that for. What would the world be like if more men were like that? I think it'd be better. And here's my question then, if that's true. And yes, there are horrific, and I've seen some of it, and I despise it, and I will root it out in every corner that I can find it. There are horrific abuses from toxic masculinity and from masculine men. I mean, I don't want to be too masculine, but I'd like to pile drive some of them. Right? I hate it. Abuses are real. Is the solution to root out all masculinity? Or is the solution to model, to teach, and to lead in ways that create good masculinity, healthy masculinity, serving masculinity? Because God has made it, and it needs to be redeemed. And I think Boaz models what that can look like and what that should look like. But there is a reason that this book is called Ruth and not Boaz. That's the other thing I want to point out here, is that in spite of the fact, and this is true, and I hate to admit this because often I read the Bible, and I do often say, and many of you have heard me say, there's nobody in here worth really modeling. There's really, a lot of the names that pop up from the Bible are not great people. Names like Judah, we saw him. Names like David, we'll talk about him next week when we talk about the woman that Matthew calls the wife of Uriah. Just saying, spoilers. Go ahead and read ahead if you want. So we have characters in the Bible that are not all that terrific. But Ruth and Boaz both, I think, demonstrate true character, two qualities that I feel safe and comfortable saying. There's some stuff here to emulate, and there really is. But you and I, if we're honest, all of us, regardless of whether we're masculine or feminine, are more like Ruth in this story. We are Ruth. Ruth models what it looks like to be us. We are terrified. We're scared. I was talking to somebody this week, and I was talking about how, I watch shows like The Walking Dead, right? I love apocalyptic TV shows. I don't know why. I just love things like that. But when I watch those and you see this group of people banded together in the face of real terrifying stuff out there, you know what I always think of? I think of the church. I think of you and me. The world is a terrifying, scary, dangerous place, and I'm afraid of it, and I need family, and I need connection, and I need people who will have my back, in anything, We are vulnerable to all sorts of attacks. And the number one thing that I think, when we're honest with ourselves and we look out there at the world, the number one threat that we see is shame. I'm afraid of being shamed. I'm afraid of being known. There's these parts of me that I don't even know are real. I'm afraid of what could happen if we have this phrase, right? Bare my soul, right? A lot of people would be terrified to do what Sandy did earlier and come up here. And And so thank you for doing that. But we're scared, even what seems like, as we're listening, that's all great. I'm sure there's a part of you that's like, I don't want to share that. And I thank you for doing it. But that's scary. It's scary to do that, to tell parts of our story that might reveal insecurities and mistakes and doubts and fears. We don't want to do that. We're terrified. And the answer we need a protector. We are so desperately in need, just like Ruth, hopeless, poor, needy, no prospects in the world to advance herself. She has none of that. Neither do we. We can't go out there. We can't charge ahead with all of our vulnerabilities, our fears, and our insecurities and be honest about. We can't do that. And so we lay down at the feet of Jesus and we say, will you cover me with your garment? Will you protect me? Will you cover my shame and let me feel your protection over me? And he says, yeah, I'm the Redeemer. I love the language. Redeemer. The one who is able to heal. The one who is able to protect. And maybe even more importantly, and this is what happens to Ruth, bring us into a better story. Ruth was a part of a different story. Ruth was not a part of the people of God. Ruth was from Moab, one of these nations over here. It's not who you are. No, you don't belong there, Ruth. And by bringing her in and covering her and marrying her, Boaz brings Ruth into an entirely different story. She leaves everything else behind, and she becomes a part of a new people. And as a matter of fact, one of the great-great-grandmothers of Jesus Christ. She's brought into a better story. You and I were brought into a better story too by the protector, the Redeemer, who grabs us from whatever people, whatever belief systems, whatever things are going to save us, whatever things we believe are going to make us better. He says, no, come over here and be a part of this story. The world is a good place that has been broken. And I, Jesus, am making it better, and I will reign again. This is our story. This is the story that we are brought into. And it's not a story that we just decide, I'm going to jump over there. It's a story that we had to be brought into. Ruth did too. She had to be married in. We have to be married into. Jesus covers us. He protects us. And when we trust in that, I truly believe we can do anything. I really do. But we have to really lean into this belief that it's Him who is God, and it's His kingdom, and it's His power, and it's His glory, not ours. Let me pray for us. Jesus, you are so good. You are so merciful. You're so kind, and I thank you that you have covered us. You have protected us. You have brought us into a family that is, in all cases, better than the ones we come from. Would you help us to believe that? Would you challenge us in those places that we need to trust that what you're calling us to is far better than what we're leaving behind? Help us to rest in the fact that you are the protector. You cover our shame. It's in your name we pray. Amen. We will